The creak of my bedroom door at 2:47 a.m. should have been my first warning. Instead, I kept my breathing steady, eyes closed, pretending to be lost in the deep sleep of someone who'd taken their prescribed sleeping pills after another grueling chemotherapy session. Through barely parted eyelids, I watched my sister Grace and my husband Marcus huddled in the doorway, their whispered voices carrying clearly across the silent room. "She won't last another month," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on my sister's lower back with an intimacy that made my stomach turn. "The oncologist said 6 weeks at most. Once she's gone, this house is worth at least $3 million. We just need to make sure the paperwork is ready." Grace's response chilled me more than any cancer diagnosis ever could. "I already have power of attorney. Remember? She signed it last month when she was so sick from the treatment. All we need is for her to finish dying." Finish dying. As if I were an inconvenient task on their to-do list, something to check off before they could move on to their real plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chin Morrison, and at 53, I thought I'd already faced my worst nightmare when doctors found the tumor in my lung 6 months ago. I was wrong. The real nightmare wasn't the cancer trying to kill me from the inside. It was discovering that the two people I trusted most were waiting like vultures for me to die, already dividing up my life before I'd even left it. But what Marcus and Grace didn't know that night, what they couldn't have known, was that my latest scan results were sitting unopened in my purse downstairs. Results that would change everything. Results that would turn their carefully laid plans to ash. Because I wasn't dying. Not anymore. And now I knew exactly who they really were. I should probably explain how a former software engineer turned boutique hotel owner found herself pretending to be asleep while her husband and sister plotted to steal everything she'd built. Marcus and I met 15 years ago at a technology conference in Seattle. He was charming, articulate, 12 years younger than me, and seemed genuinely impressed by my success. I just sold my second startup for a sum that would have let me retire comfortably, but retirement wasn't in my vocabulary then. I was already planning my next venture, converting historic properties into luxury boutique hotels. Marcus was working as a financial consultant, or so he claimed. Looking back, I realize I never actually saw any of his clients, never met any colleagues from his supposed firm. But love makes you blind to red flags that seem obvious in hindsight. He was attentive, supportive, always encouraging my ambitions. When I bought the Whitmore estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion in Marin County that would become my flagship hotel, Marcus was right there beside me, offering to help manage the renovations. We married 2 years after we met, a small ceremony at the estate just after its transformation was complete. Grace was my maid of honor, of course. She'd been more than a sister to me. She'd been my best friend, my confidant, the one person who'd stood by me through our parents' death, through my divorce from my first husband, through every triumph and setback of building my business empire. Grace was a real estate agent, not hugely successful but comfortable enough. Or so I thought. It would be months before I learned about her mounting debts, the gambling problem she'd hidden so carefully, the desperate financial situation that had apparently made my success feel less like sisterly pride and more like a mockery of her own failures. The Whitmore estate became even more successful than I dreamed. Within 3 years, I'd expanded to 4 properties along the California coast, each one a careful restoration of historical architecture transformed into intimate luxury accommodations. The press called me a visionary. Architectural Digest featured our properties twice. We hosted celebrities, tech moguls, international visitors who paid premium prices for the privacy and elegance we offered. My net worth climbed steadily into the 8 figures, most of it tied up in real estate and the business itself. Through it all, Marcus played the role of supportive husband perfectly. He helped with the business when I asked, backed off when I didn't, never showed any obvious resentment about the fact that my success far exceeded his. He even insisted on signing a postnuptial agreement 5 years into our marriage, saying he wanted to prove he loved me for me, not for my money. I was so touched by the gesture that I barely read the document. Another mistake that would come back to haunt me. Grace, meanwhile, became my informal business advisor. She had good instincts about real estate, understood market trends, helped me identify properties with potential. I paid her generously as a consultant, covered her health insurance, Even bought her a condo in Sausalito so she could be closer to me. I thought I was being a good sister. I didn't realize I was feeding a resentment that had been growing since we were children, since I'd gotten the scholarships, the opportunities, the success that she felt should have been hers. The cancer diagnosis came out of nowhere. A persistent cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue I attributed to overwork, finally a scan that showed a shadow on my left lung. Stage IA non-small cell lung cancer, the oncologist said. Advanced but treatable. Aggressive chemotherapy and radiation might give me a fighting chance. The news hit me like a physical blow, but I've never been one to give up without a fight. I immediately started treatment at UCSF, one of the best cancer centers in the country. The oncologist, Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, was cautiously optimistic. The tumor was responding to treatment, shrinking with each round of chemotherapy. But I didn't share that optimism with Marcus and Grace. Not at first. I was too sick, too frightened, too focused on just getting through each day of treatment. And they were so wonderful in those early weeks. Marcus taking time off work to drive me to appointments, Grace moving into our guest room to help with my care. They held my hand through the worst of it, cleaned up when I was sick, kept telling me I was strong enough to beat this. Their support felt like the only thing keeping me going. It was Grace who suggested the power of attorney. Just temporary, she said, during one of my worst weeks of treatment. Someone needs to be able to handle things if you're too sick. Pay bills, manage the hotels, make medical decisions if needed. It made sense at the time. I was barely functional, could hardly focus long enough to sign my own name. Marcus agreed it was sensible, said Grace was the obvious choice as my only family. So I signed. Another mistake in a growing list of them. The pretending started small. I'd begun feeling better after the 4th round of chemo, but I didn't let on. Something about the way Marcus and Grace looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching, little moments of connection that felt too intimate, too secretive. So I played up my weakness, let them think I was getting worse even as Dr. Hartley's treatments were working their miracle. It became a twisted kind of experiment. How would they act if they thought I was really dying? The answer came gradually, then all at once. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. Papers hastily shoved into drawers when I appeared unexpectedly. Grace spending more and more time at the house. She and Marcus often disappearing together for what they called errands or estate planning meetings. I might have convinced myself it was all innocent concern if not for the night I found them in my study, going through my financial documents, discussing property valuations in hushed tones. But nothing could have prepared me for that night, lying in my bed, listening to them plan my death like it was a business merger. The casual cruelty of it, the calculation, the complete absence of grief or hesitation. These were the two people I loved most in the world, and they were eager for me to die. The hotel in Carmel will sell fastest, Grace was saying, her voice practical, professional. I already have some interested buyers making quiet inquiries. The Santa Barbara property might take longer, but it'll fetch the highest price. We'll need to move quickly once it happens, Marcus replied, before any of her executive team starts asking questions. Thank God she never had kids. No other heirs to complicate things. Except the charities in her will, Grace reminded him. Marcus made a dismissive sound. Wills can be contested, especially when the deceased was clearly not of sound mind in her final days. All that morphine, the confusion from the cancer spreading to her brain. It hasn't spread to her brain, Grace said. Not yet, Marcus replied. But who's to say what might appear in the medical records later? You have power of attorney. You control access to those records now. The implication was clear. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they were prepared to rewrite history after I was gone, to paint me as mentally incompetent, to steal not just my properties but my legacy, my dignity, my very identity. I lay there for another hour, forcing myself to remain still as they planned the dismantling of everything I'd built. They discussed bank accounts I didn't even know Marcus knew about. They talked about Grace's debts, apparently close to $500,000, and how quickly they could pay them off once they had access to my funds. They even discussed their future together because of course this wasn't just about money. They were in love, had been for who knows how long, and I was the only obstacle to their happily ever after. When they finally left, convinced I was deep in a medicated sleep, I waited another full hour before moving. Then I crept downstairs to my purse and retrieved the envelope from Dr. Hartley. My hands shook as I opened it, though from rage now rather than fear. The scan results were better than I dared hope. The tumor had shrunk by 70%. No metastasis. No spread. Dr. Hartley's handwritten note was jubilant. Remarkable response to treatment. Recommend 2 more rounds for complete remission. Prognosis excellent. Complete remission. I was going to live. And now I knew exactly who I'd be living without. I didn't confront them immediately. That would have been the emotional response, and emotions had already led me to too many mistakes. Instead, I became a detective in my own life, gathering evidence while maintaining my facade of weakness. During the day, I played the dying woman, letting Marcus and Grace fuss over me, accepting their false sympathy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Even adding dramatic coughing fits that sent them exchanging meaningful glances. At night, when they thought I was sedated, I searched through everything: Marcus's laptop, Grace's phone when she left it charging, every document in my study. What I found was a masterclass in long-term deception. Marcus hadn't worked as a financial consultant in years. His business trips were funded by money he'd been skimming from our joint investment accounts. Small amounts I'd never noticed because I trusted him to manage that portion of our finances. He'd been essentially living off me while building a careful paper trail that made it look like he was a successful professional in his own right. Grace's situation was even worse than they'd discussed. She wasn't just in debt from gambling. She'd been borrowing against properties she managed, using her real estate license to commit fraud that would have landed her in prison if discovered. She'd been one investigation away from losing everything when my cancer diagnosis provided what must have seemed like a gift from heaven, a way out through my death. The postnuptial agreement Marcus had so generously insisted on? I finally read it carefully. While it seemed to protect my assets in case of divorce, there was a clause about inheritance that essentially gave him control of the entire estate if I died while married to him, as long as we'd been married for more than 10 years. We were at year 13. The timing of their plan wasn't coincidental. They needed me dead while that agreement was still valid. I discovered something else during my late-night investigations. Grace had been slowly poisoning me. Not enough to kill, that would be too suspicious. But enough to keep me weak, to make the cancer seem worse than it was. I found the bottles hidden in her room, researched the symptoms online. The extreme fatigue, the confusion, the nausea that seemed worse than what chemo alone should cause. It all made sense now. She'd been adding small doses to my food, my drinks, keeping me dependent on her care. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was cold, calculating, patient. I stopped eating anything Grace prepared, claiming I had no appetite. I secretly flushed the medication she gave me, palming the pills and disposing of them later. Within a week, my head was clearer than it had been in months. Dr. Hartley commented on my sudden improvement at my next appointment, which I attended alone, telling Marcus and Grace I didn't want to burden them with yet another long hospital visit. "It's remarkable," Dr. Hartley said, reviewing my latest blood work. "Your numbers are better than they've been since diagnosis. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was no longer being slowly poisoned by my sister. But I couldn't tell her that. Not yet. I started making my own plans. First, I contacted James Whitman, my company's chief legal counsel, requesting a confidential meeting. I told him I needed to update my estate planning and corporate structure. He was surprised but professional, agreeing to meet me at his private office rather than at company headquarters where Marcus might hear about it. Next, I reached out to Diana Foster, an old friend from my tech days who now worked in digital forensics. I hired her quietly to do a complete analysis of my digital footprint, my finances, my properties, everything Marcus and Grace might have accessed or altered. What she found was disturbing but invaluable. They'd been in my email, my banking apps, even my medical portal. But they'd been sloppy, leaving digital fingerprints everywhere. The hardest call was to my first husband, Nathan. We divorced amicably 15 years ago, remaining distant friends. He was remarried, happy, living in Portland with his new family. But he was also a retired FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator. I needed someone I could trust absolutely, and despite our failed marriage, I knew Nathan's integrity was unimpeachable. Victoria. His surprise was evident. Is everything okay? I heard about the cancer. I need your help, I said simply. And I need absolute discretion. Can you come to San Francisco? Not to the house. I'll text you a location. He arrived 2 days later and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You need to go to the police, he said finally. With what proof? A overheard conversation? Suspicions about poisoning? They have power of attorney, Nathan. They could claim I'm paranoid from the cancer, the treatment, the medications. Who would believe me over my devoted husband and caring sister? He saw my point. Then we get proof. Real evidence. How good are your acting skills? Very good, as it turned out. Nathan helped me set up recording devices in my home. Completely legal since it was my property. I started documenting everything. Conversations, their activities when they thought I was asleep. Even video of Grace preparing my meals with her special additions. Nathan also discovered something I'd missed. Marcus had been in contact with a life insurance company about a policy on me that I'd never authorized. He hadn't purchased it yet, but the intent was clear. Meanwhile, I continued my charade of declining health. I even called Marcus and Grace into my bedroom one evening for what I portrayed as a final confession. I want to thank you both, I said weakly, reaching for their hands, for everything you've done. I know I haven't been easy to care for. Don't talk like that, Grace said, tears that almost looked genuine filling her eyes. You're going to beat this. The doctor says maybe 3 more weeks. I lied, watching their reactions carefully. Marcus squeezed my hand, his face a mask of false sorrow, but I saw the quick glance he shot Grace, the barely suppressed excitement. I've been thinking about my will, I continued. I want to make sure you're both taken care of. You've given up so much to help me. We don't care about that, Marcus said quickly. Too quickly. We just want you to be comfortable. Still, I insisted. I've asked James to come by tomorrow with some papers, just to make sure everything is in order. The panic that flashed across their faces was beautiful. They thought I was going to change my will, potentially ruining their plans. Grace actually gripped my hand hard enough to hurt. You don't need to worry about that now, she said. Save your strength. I have power of attorney, remember? I can handle any legal matters. Of course, I agreed weakly. You're right. I'm just so confused lately. Must be the medications. They relaxed visibly, and I knew they'd be searching for those non-existent legal documents as soon as they thought I was asleep. James did come the next day, but not with a will. Instead, he brought dissolution papers for the postnuptial agreement and documents transferring all my properties into an irrevocable trust that Grace couldn't touch with her power of attorney. I signed everything in the bathroom while supposedly sick from chemo. Then James left with the documents safely in his possession. Marcus and Grace never knew he'd been there. The next phase of my plan required Dr. Hartley's cooperation. I explained the situation, not all of it, just enough. I told her I was dealing with a difficult family situation and needed complete confidentiality about my medical status. She was uncomfortable but agreed to doctor-patient privilege. More importantly, she agreed to keep my recovery secret from anyone who might inquire, including family members. I also started chemotherapy again, not because I needed it medically, but because I needed to maintain the illusion. Dr. Hartley reduced the dosage significantly, just enough to keep my hair thin and my appearance gaunt, but not enough to actually make me sick. The real illness symptoms I could fake, having had plenty of practice with the real thing. Nathan, meanwhile, had discovered something explosive. Grace hadn't just been gambling. She'd been embezzling from clients. She'd used her position as a real estate agent to take deposits for properties, then diverted the funds to cover her debts. She'd managed to hide it so far by juggling transactions, but she was one failed deal away from exposure. She needed my money not just to pay debts but to cover her crimes before someone noticed. Marcus's secrets were different but equally damaging. He'd been married before, something he'd never told me. His ex-wife lived in Nevada, and according to court records, their divorce had never been finalized. He'd abandoned her when her tech startup failed, leaving her with nothing, and simply started a new life in California. Our marriage wasn't just built on lies, it was legally invalid. 3 weeks after that night, I pretended to sleep through their planning session. Everything was in place. The recordings, the evidence of poisoning, the financial fraud, the bigamy, we had it all. Nathan had contacted his former colleagues at the FBI about Grace's interstate fraud. Diana had documented every digital crime. James had restructured my entire estate. All that remained was the finale. I chose a Thursday evening. Marcus and Grace were in the kitchen cooking dinner, or rather, Grace was cooking while Marcus opened wine. They'd been especially attentive lately, perhaps sensing the end was near. I played my part perfectly that week, barely able to walk, confused in my conversations, sleeping 20 hours a day. I made my way downstairs slowly, clutching the banister, looking every inch the dying woman. They turned when they heard me, faces shifting quickly to expressions of concern. "Darling, you shouldn't be up," Marcus said, moving toward me. "I needed to see you both," I said weakly, then let my legs buckle. Marcus caught me, guided me to a chair. "I have something important to tell you." They exchanged glances, hopeful, eager. They thought this was it, the final goodbye. "I know what you've been planning," I said clearly, my voice suddenly strong. "I heard everything that night 3 weeks ago. Every single word." The transformation in their faces was instantaneous. Marcus stepped back as if I'd slapped him. Grace dropped the plate she was holding, and it shattered on the tile floor. "Victoria," Grace started, "you're confused. The medications. The medications you've been poisoning me with." I interrupted, standing now, all pretense of weakness gone. "The ones I haven't actually been taking for the past 3 weeks? Those medications?" "This is insane," Marcus said, but his face had gone pale. "You're sick. You don't know what you're saying." I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen. Their voices filled the kitchen, the conversation from that night crystal clear. "She won't last another month. Once she's gone, this house is worth at least $3 million. You recorded us." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "In my own home?" "Yes, completely legal. Unlike poisoning your sister or bigamy." I looked at Marcus when I said the last word, watched the remaining color drain from his face. "Oh yes," I continued. "I know about Linda in Nevada. Your actual wife. The one you're still married to. Which makes our marriage fraudulent and your claim to my estate non-existent." Marcus sank into a chair, his elaborate facade finally crumbling. "And you," I turned to Grace, "embezzling from your clients to cover gambling debts? The FBI is very interested in that. Agent Harrison said to expect them tomorrow morning." Grace's legs gave out. She slid down the cabinet to sit on the floor among the broken plate shards, tears streaming down her face. But I wasn't done. "The cancer is in remission, by the way. Has been for weeks. Dr. Hartley says I'll make a complete recovery. Probably live another 30 years. Plenty of time to watch you both rot in prison." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice hollow. "What do you want?" "Want?" I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "I wanted a husband who loved me. I wanted a sister I could trust. But what I want now is simpler. I want you out. Both of you. Tonight. Take nothing but your clothes. Everything else in this house was bought with my money." "You can't just," Grace started. "I can and I will. The divorce papers will be delivered to you tomorrow, Marcus. Though I suppose we'll need annulment papers instead, given that our marriage was never legal. Grace, your power of attorney was revoked yesterday. All my properties have been transferred to a trust you can't touch." "Where are we supposed to go?" Grace asked, and for the first time since childhood she looked small, lost. "That's not my problem anymore." I felt nothing, no sympathy, no residual love, just a cold emptiness where my affection for them used to live. "Nathan is outside. He'll escort you while you pack. You have 1 hour." "Nathan." They both looked toward the door where my first husband stood, all 6'4" of him, still intimidating even at 60. He'd been listening from the hallway, ready if things turned violent. "Hello, Marcus," Nathan said pleasantly. "Grace. Let's make this easy, shall we?" What followed was almost anticlimactic. They packed in silence while Nathan watched. Grace tried once more to appeal to me, invoking our parents, our childhood, the bond between sisters. I simply turned away. Marcus said nothing, perhaps realizing that anything he said could make his legal situation worse. When they were gone, when Nathan had seen them drive away in Marcus's car, the one luxury item I let him keep, only because it was leased in his name, I stood alone in my kitchen and waited to feel something. Relief, sadness, anger, anything. But there was only numbness and a strange sense of lightness, like I'd been carrying weights I hadn't known were there and had finally set them down. Nathan returned, found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I should feel something, shouldn't I? They were my family." "Family doesn't try to kill you for money," he said bluntly. "You did what you had to do." Did I? Could I have handled it differently? Confronted them sooner? And risked them covering their tracks better? "No, Victoria. You played this exactly right." He sat across from me. "What will you do now?" It was a good question. My life had been defined by my business, my marriage, my relationship with my sister. Now the marriage was revealed as a fraud, my sister as a would-be killer, and my business, well, it would survive, but did I want to pour myself into it the way I had before? "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to live. Really live. Not just survive or succeed or accumulate. Actually live." The epilogue, if you can call it that, came 6 months later. Grace was serving 3 to 5 years for fraud and attempted poisoning. She'd taken a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. Marcus had fled to Mexico to avoid bigamy charges and fraud prosecution. Linda, his legal wife, had been located and was pursuing him for years of unpaid alimony. I sold 2 of my hotels, keeping only the original Whitmore estate and the Carmel property. The money went partly to charity, partly to establishing a foundation for women rebuilding their lives after domestic betrayal. I named it the Phoenix Trust because that's what we were. Women rising from the ashes of our former lives. Dr. Hartley officially declared me cancer-free at my 1-year follow-up. The relief was overwhelming but also complicated. The cancer had saved my life in a way, exposing the rot that had been slowly killing me from within. Not in my lungs but in my home, my bed, my family. I started dating again, tentatively. Not looking for another husband but for companionship. Someone to share dinner with who wasn't plotting to steal my assets. I traveled, really traveled, not just for business but for joy. I learned to paint, badly but enthusiastically. I adopted a dog, a scraggly rescue who trusted no one at first but gradually learned to sleep peacefully at my feet. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that moment when I lay in bed pretending to sleep, listening to my sister and husband plan my death. How easy it would have been to never wake up, to let them win, to simply fade away as they expected. But I didn't. I chose to fight, not just the cancer but the betrayal, the attempted theft of not just my property but my dignity, my legacy, my right to live. The house feels different now. Lighter despite being emptier. I had the bedroom completely renovated, new furniture, new paint, even new flooring. Nothing remains of that night except the memory, and even that fades a little more each day. The doorway where they stood planning my demise is now home to a bookshelf filled with all the novels I never had time to read when I was busy building an empire and maintaining a false marriage. Friends ask if I'm lonely. The truth is, I was lonelier when Marcus and Grace were here, when I was surrounded by false love and hidden agendas. Now, alone in my house with my dog and my books and my hard-won peace, I'm more complete than I ever was as part of that toxic triangle. There's a certain power in surviving betrayal of this magnitude. It strips away all the polite fictions we tell ourselves about family, about love, about trust. It leaves you raw but also remarkably clear-eyed. I know now that I can survive anything because I've already survived the worst, not cancer but the discovery that the people I loved most wanted me dead. And that's the real plot twist in this story. They thought they were stealing my house, my money, my life. But what they actually gave me was freedom. Freedom from false obligations, from toxic relationships, from the exhausting pretense that blood means loyalty. They gave me permission to choose myself fully and completely for the first time in my life. So when people ask how I'm doing now, I tell them the truth. I'm alive. Not just breathing, not just cancer-free, but truly, brilliantly, defiantly alive. And that's worth more than any house, any fortune, any relationship built on lies. The Whitmore estate still stands, grander than ever, welcoming guests who have no idea about the drama that once unfolded in its owner's private quarters. But I know. Every time I walk through that doorway I remember. And every time I choose to keep walking forward into a future that's entirely mine. Because that's what survival really means, not just enduring but choosing again and again to live on your own terms. And that's exactly what I plan to do with whatever years I have left. All 30 or 40 of them, if Dr. Hartley's prognosis is correct. Years that Marcus and Grace thought would be theirs to plunder. Years that are now mine alone to fill with whatever brings me joy. The ultimate revenge, it turns out, isn't sending them to prison or taking away their ill-gotten gains. It's living well, living long, and living without them. It's becoming the person I was always meant to be before their poison, literal and metaphorical, started slowly killing me. And so I live, one genuine day at a time. In my house that they'll never steal, with my health they couldn't destroy, and my spirit they never really touched. Because you can't steal what someone refuses to give you. And I refuse to give them anything more. Not my energy, not my anger, not even my hatred. They get nothing but the consequences of their choices while I get everything. My life, my freedom, my future. That's the real ending to this story. Not with their punishment but with my liberation. Not with what they lost but with what I found. And what I found, lying there pretending to sleep while they plotted my death, was myself, stronger, clearer, and more fiercely alive than ever before. The weeks following my discovery became an elaborate performance, each day requiring me to sink deeper into a role I never auditioned for. The dying woman who didn't know she was being murdered. Nathan proved invaluable during this period, not just for his investigative skills but for his steady presence when the weight of deception threatened to crush me. We met twice a week at a small cafe in Sausalito, far from anywhere Marcus or Grace might venture. These meetings became my lifeline, the only moments when I could drop the mask and speak truthfully about what was happening in my own home. "You're losing weight," Nathan observed during one of these meetings. His detectives, "I'm missing nothing. Are you actually eating the food you're pretending to eat?" I stirred my coffee absently, avoiding his concerned gaze. "I can't risk it. Even though I'm disposing of most of what Grace prepares, some nights I have to take a few bites to maintain the illusion. Just enough to make her think I'm consuming her poison cocktails. This is dangerous, Victoria. We have enough evidence. You should get out now." "Not yet," I insisted, though I knew he was right. If I reveal what I know too soon, they'll have time to cover their tracks. Grace has been moving money through a complex web of accounts. I need Diana to trace all of it. And Marcus. There's something else going on with Marcus. Something beyond the bigamy. Nathan leaned back, studying me with those sharp gray eyes that had once made him such an effective FBI agent. "You're not just gathering evidence anymore. You're punishing yourself." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Every night I lay in that bed, in the room I'd once shared with Marcus, listening to him breathe, feeling him shift beside me, knowing he was counting down the days until my death. It was a form of self-torture. But it was also necessary. I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal, needed to know exactly who these people were that I'd allowed into my life, my heart, my will. Diana's digital forensics revealed layers of deception that stunned even Nathan. Marcus hadn't just been idle while pretending to work. He'd been actively building a parallel life. He had rental properties in Nevada under his legal wife's name, bought with money siphoned from our accounts. He'd been traveling there monthly, maintaining that relationship while playing devoted husband to me. The business trips I'd never questioned were conjugal visits to his real life. Even more disturbing were the email exchanges Diana uncovered between Marcus and someone named Derek Castellano, a known associate of organized crime families in Las Vegas. The emails were coded, careful, but the implications were clear. Marcus owed money, significant money, to people who didn't accept bankruptcy as a form of payment. My death wasn't just about greed. It was about Marcus's survival. Without my assets, he was a dead man walking. "This changes everything," Nathan said when I shared the discovery. "These aren't just greedy relatives anymore. If Marcus is connected to organized crime, if he owes them money, then your life is in real danger. We need to involve the FBI now." But I hesitated. Once the FBI was involved, I'd lose control of the situation. Everything would become official, procedural, public. The hotels would be dragged into a scandal. My employees, many of whom had been with me for years, would be caught in the crossfire. And perhaps most importantly, I wouldn't get the answers I needed, not just about what Marcus and Grace had done, but about why and how I'd been so blind to it. So I compromised. Nathan contacted his former partner, Special Agent Sarah Harrison, unofficially. She agreed to monitor the situation, to be ready to move if needed, but to let me play out my hand first. It was dangerous, she warned, but she understood the need for closure, for control in a situation where I'd had so little. The house itself became my prison and my stage. Every room held memories that were now tainted, every corner a potential hiding place for their secrets. I found myself cataloging the lies, creating a mental inventory of deceptions. The weekend Marcus had supposedly attended a financial conference in Chicago. Credit card records showed he'd been in Reno. The time Grace had borrowed $50,000 for a real estate investment opportunity, the money had gone straight to a casino's high roller account. 3 weeks into my investigation, something unexpected happened. Olivia Hartman appeared at my door. Olivia was my business partner from my tech days, someone I hadn't seen in 5 years but who had once been as close as a sister, closer apparently than my actual sister. She stood on my doorstep, elegant as ever in her 60s, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. "My God, Victoria," she said, taking in my appearance. "You look terrible." "Cancer will do that," I replied, inviting her in while texting Nathan to let him know I had an unexpected visitor. "That's not what I mean," Olivia said bluntly. She'd never been one to mince words. "You look haunted. What's really going on?" I wanted to tell her everything, to collapse into the comfort of an old friendship that predated all of this madness. But Marcus was home, working in his study, or pretending to work while probably planning my funeral. Grace was in the kitchen, and I couldn't risk them overhearing. "Just the treatment," I lied. "It's been harder than expected." Olivia studied me for a long moment, and I saw the tech CEO she'd become, the woman who could read code and people with equal accuracy. "Bullshit," she said quietly. "But I understand if you can't talk about it now. I'm in town for a week. My number hasn't changed." After she left, I found myself shaking. The simple kindness of an old friend, someone who actually cared about my well-being without ulterior motives, had nearly undone me. It highlighted the absolute absence of genuine care from the two people who claimed to love me most. That night, I made a dangerous decision. I would push them, see how far they were willing to go. During dinner, I announced that I was feeling better, that Dr. Hartley was optimistic about a new treatment option. "I might have more time than we thought," I said, watching their faces carefully. "Maybe even years." The flash of panic in Marcus's eyes was immediate, though he covered it quickly with a forced smile. "That's wonderful, darling. We should celebrate." Grace's reaction was more subtle but more telling. Her hand tightened on her wine glass so hard I thought it might shatter. "What does Dr. Hartley say exactly?" I thought. Last week you seemed so much worse." "These things can change," I said vaguely. "The human body is mysterious." That night, they had another late-night conference in the hallway outside my room. I lay still, feigning sleep, recording everything. "This is a problem," Marcus hissed. "If she recovers, if she lives even another year." "She won't," Grace interrupted. "I'll increase the dosage. Not enough to be suspicious, but enough to counteract any improvement." "And if that doesn't work?" There was a long pause. Then Grace said something that chilled me to my core. "There are other ways. Accidents happen, especially to people weakened by cancer treatment." They were escalating. My ploy to gauge their desperation had worked too well. They weren't just willing to wait for me to die. They were willing to make it happen. The next morning, I called Nathan immediately. "We need to move faster. They're planning something." But even as we accelerated our plans, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. It wasn't just about Marcus and Grace anymore. The mention of Derek Castellano, the Las Vegas connection, the organized crime element, it all pointed to something larger than a simple inheritance grab. Diana's continued investigation revealed the full picture. Marcus owed Castellano $3 million, the result of a failed investment scheme he'd entered into 5 years ago. He'd been paying interest only, barely keeping the wolves at bay, but Castellano had recently demanded full payment. The timeline was clear: Marcus had 6 months to pay, or face consequences that didn't bear thinking about. My death was his only way out. But it was what Diana found next that truly shocked me. Grace wasn't just a willing accomplice, she was the architect. Email exchanges from 2 years ago showed her planting the idea in Marcus's mind, suggesting that my cancer diagnosis was an opportunity. She'd researched the poisons, found suppliers through dark web connections, even consulted with a disbarred doctor about dosages that would mimic cancer progression. My sister, my blood, had been planning my death for 2 years. The cancer hadn't been the opportunity. It had been the excuse, the cover story for a murder they'd been orchestrating long before any tumor appeared in my lung. I sat with this knowledge for days, unable to fully process it. Every memory of Grace and me together, childhood birthdays, our parents' funeral where we'd held each other and sobbed, her maid of honor speech at my wedding to Marcus where she talked about how happy she was that I'd found true love, all of it was retroactively poisoned. Had she ever loved me? Or had I always been just a resource to her? A wallet with a sister's face? James Whitman, my lawyer, was quietly horrified as I laid out the legal implications of what we'd discovered. The fraud alone would destroy them, but attempted murder, conspiracy, connections to organized crime. This was a federal case that would make headlines. You need protection, he insisted. Professional security. This is beyond what Nathan can provide alone. He was right. I hired a discreet security firm, bodyguards who knew how to be invisible. They watched the house from unmarked cars, followed me at a distance when I left for appointments. Marcus and Grace never noticed, too focused on their own plans to realize they were being surveilled. The technology Diana had access to revealed even more disturbing details. Marcus had been researching insulin overdoses, how they could mimic natural death in diabetics. I wasn't diabetic, but medical records could be altered, especially with Grace's power of attorney. They'd been in contact with a coroner in Nevada who, for the right price, would sign off on natural causes without an autopsy. Every detail they planned made my skin crawl. They weren't just planning to kill me. They were planning to erase me, to rewrite the story of my death to suit their narrative. In their version, I would die peacefully, gratefully, leaving everything to my devoted husband and caring sister who had seen me through my final days. For weeks after that first overheard conversation, I decided to test something else. I had Diana create fake medical records showing that my condition had deteriorated, that the cancer had spread to my brain, that I was experiencing confusion and paranoia. Then I deliberately left my medical portal open on my laptop where Grace would see it. She took the bait immediately. Within hours, she was on the phone with someone, a lawyer from what I could hear, discussing grounds for challenging my mental capacity. If I was paranoid and confused, any recent changes to my will or estate could be contested. She was building a case for my incompetence while I was still alive. That evening, she was especially solicitous, bringing me tea with honey. Her special blend, she called it. I took it gratefully, then excused myself to the bathroom where I poured it down the sink. When I returned, she was watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Any confusion? Headaches?" "A little foggy," I lied. "Must be the new medications." She nodded, satisfied. "Maybe we should have Dr. Hartley evaluate your mental state, just to be safe." "That's thoughtful of you," I replied, playing along. "You're always looking out for me." The irony was lost on her. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. Sociopaths, I'd learned from my research, often can't recognize irony when it relates to their own behavior. Nathan had been researching too, but his focus was on legal precedents, cases of family members attempting to murder for inheritance. The statistics were sobering. Most victims didn't survive to see justice. They were usually elderly, isolated, dependent on their killers for care. The few who did survive often couldn't prove intent, couldn't demonstrate that their decline wasn't natural. "You're lucky," he told me during one of our meetings. "If you hadn't overheard that conversation, if you hadn't been suspicious enough to investigate, you'd be dead within the year." Lucky. It was a strange word for my situation. Lucky to discover that my husband and sister were trying to murder me. Lucky to be recording evidence of their crimes. Lucky to have resources they didn't know about, friends they'd never met, a support system beyond their control. Diana's next discovery added another layer to the horror show. Grace had taken out life insurance policies on me, multiple policies with different companies, all small enough to avoid triggering automatic investigations, all taken out over the past 2 years. The total payout would be $5 million. She'd forged my signature, used her power of attorney to access my medical records, created a paper trail that made it look like I'd been planning for my death long before the cancer diagnosis. This is sophisticated, Diana told me, admiration mixing with disgust in her voice. She's thought of everything. If you hadn't caught on, this would have looked completely legitimate. The phrase haunted me. She's thought of everything. My sister had spent 2 years meticulously planning my murder, considering every angle, every potential problem. The effort involved, the dedication to my destruction, was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Marcus, meanwhile, was getting increasingly agitated. His debt to Castellano was coming due, and my continued survival was a problem he couldn't solve. He started drinking more, pacing the house at night, making calls in hushed, urgent tones. Once I heard him pleading with someone, promising payment soon, swearing on his life that the money was coming. It was, I realized, literally true. He was swearing on his life because without my money, his life was forfeit. It didn't make me sympathetic. He'd chosen to gamble with dangerous people, chosen to see my death as his solution. But it did make me understand the desperation driving him. Grace was motivated by greed and resentment. Marcus was motivated by survival. The security team reported something troubling. A car with Nevada plates had been parked near our house 3 times in the past week. The driver never got out, just sat there for hours watching. When they ran the plates, it came back registered to a shell company linked to Castellano's organization. They weren't just waiting for Marcus to pay. They were monitoring the situation, possibly preparing to take matters into their own hands if Marcus failed to deliver. This is escalating beyond what we can handle, Nathan said firmly. It's time to involve the FBI officially. This isn't just about you anymore. There are interstate crimes, organized crime connections. People beyond you could get hurt. He was right, but I needed just a little more time. The trust documents James had prepared were complex, designed to protect not just my assets but my employees, the hotels, the legacy Robert and I had built. Everything needed to be in place before I pulled the trigger on exposing Marcus and Grace. I also had another concern, my reputation. Not vanity, but practical consideration for my business. If this became public, if the media got hold of the story, every article about my hotels would lead with this scandal. Every review would mention the owner who was almost murdered by her family. I needed to find a way to control the narrative, to protect the innocent people who depended on my company for their livelihoods. So I did what I'd always done in business, I strategized. I had Diana create a complete digital backup of all evidence, stored in multiple secure locations. I had James establish a crisis management plan for the company, ready to implement the moment the news broke. I even prepared statements for my employees, explaining the situation in terms that would minimize panic and speculation. 5 weeks into my investigation, something changed in the house. Marcus and Grace were barely speaking to each other, the strain of my continued survival driving a wedge between conspirators. They snapped at each other over small things, avoided being in the same room. The alliance was fracturing. I decided to exploit this crack. One evening when Grace was out, I approached Marcus in his study. He looked up, startled as if seeing a ghost, which in his mind I probably should have been by now. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down across from him. "About what?" His voice was cautious, wary. "About us. About our marriage. I know things have been strained with my illness, but I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done." The guilt that flashed across his face was almost comical. "Victoria, I've been thinking about the future," I continued. "If I do recover, if this new treatment works, maybe we should consider renewing our vows. Starting fresh." His panic was palpable. That's a lovely thought. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You need to focus on your health." "You're right," I agreed. "It's just lying in that bed, possibly dying. It makes you think about what really matters. And what matters to me is you, Marcus. You and Grace. My family." He actually flinched at the word family. "We feel the same way," he managed. "Do you?" I asked, allowing a note of vulnerability into my voice. "Sometimes I wonder if you'd both be better off without me." Less burden, less worry. Don't say that, he replied automatically, though his eyes betrayed the truth. He'd been thinking exactly that. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Marcus? If something did happen to me, would you take care of Grace? She's been so devoted, but I worry about her future. The look that crossed his face was complicated. Guilt, fear, and something else. Disgust? Had their alliance soured to the point of mutual contempt? Of course, he said, but the words were hollow. That night they argued. Not in whispers but in harsh, angry tones they thought I couldn't hear from my drugged sleep. You said she'd be dead by now, Marcus accused. Your poisons aren't working. They're working fine, Grace shot back. She's dying just slowly. If you're in such a hurry, why don't you handle it yourself? That wasn't the plan. The plan was natural causes, no suspicion. Plans change. Your criminal friends breathing down your neck changes things. They're not my friends. And if you hadn't gambled away every cent you had. If I hadn't? You're the one who owes millions to the mob. Their partnership was dissolving, eaten away by fear and greed and the stress of their extended deception. Good. Let them destroy each other from within while I documented their destruction from without. The next day brought a new complication. Dr. Hartley called with genuine concern. My latest blood work showed irregularities that didn't match my improving cancer markers. Toxins that shouldn't be there, levels that suggested poisoning. Victoria, she said carefully, I need to ask you something in complete confidence. Is someone trying to hurt you? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected. I could lie, maintain my charade a little longer. Or I could bring in an ally who could provide medical documentation of attempted murder. Yes, I said simply. Can you document everything you've found? And can you do it quietly? Dr. Hartley didn't hesitate. I'll run additional tests, create a comprehensive report. Do you need me to contact the police? Not yet. But soon. She understood the gravity immediately. Be careful, Victoria. If someone is poisoning you deliberately, you're in serious danger. If only she knew how serious. But her medical evidence would be crucial when the time came to press charges. Grace had been careful with her poison selection, choosing substances that mimicked cancer symptoms, but she hadn't counted on a doctor as thorough as Elizabeth Hartley. That evening I overheard Marcus on a call that changed everything. No, I need more time, he was saying, desperation clear in his voice. The situation is complicated. Yes, I understand the consequences. What if I could offer something else as collateral? There was a long pause then. The hotels. I could get you the hotels. My blood went cold. He wasn't just planning to inherit my money. He was planning to hand my life's work over to criminals. The hotels Robert and I had built, the employees who depended on them, the guests who trusted us, all of it would become a money laundering front for the mob. That was the final straw. I couldn't wait any longer. Whatever evidence we still needed would have to be enough. I texted Nathan. Tomorrow. We moved tomorrow. But Grace had plans of her own. That night, she came into my room with her special tea and a syringe she claimed was a new vitamin injection Dr. Hartley had prescribed. It'll help with your energy, she said, approaching my bed. I'd never been more awake, more alert, more ready to fight for my life. But I stayed still, letting her come closer, knowing the cameras Nathan had installed were recording everything. Grace, I said softly, just as she reached for my arm. I know what you're doing. She froze, the syringe inches from my skin. I know everything, I continued, sitting up, my voice steady and clear. The poison in the tea. The life insurance policies. The plan to declare me mentally incompetent. All of it. The syringe fell from her hand, clattering on the hardwood floor. Her face cycled through emotions, shock, fear, anger, before settling on something cold and desperate. You don't know what you're talking about, she said. The cancer has affected your mind. The only thing affecting my mind is the arsenic you've been feeding me. Yes, Grace, I know about the arsenic. Dr. Hartley confirmed it. She has blood samples, documentation, enough evidence to put you away for attempted murder. Grace took a step back, then another, until she hit the wall. Victoria, You what? You're sorry? You didn't mean it? You were desperate? Which excuse are you going with? Her mask finally slipped completely. revealing the stranger my sister had become. You had everything, she hissed. Everything always came so easy to you. The grades, the scholarships, the success. And you just kept getting more while I struggled for scraps. So you decided to kill me for it? I decided to take what should have been mine, she corrected. What would have been mine if you hadn't always been the special one, the smart one, the lucky one? Lucky? I laughed, the sound bitter. I'm lying here being slowly poisoned by my sister while my bigamist husband plans to hand my hotels over to the mob. Yes, I'm certainly the lucky one. The mention of Marcus's mob connections made her pause. What are you talking about? You didn't know? Your partner in crime owes $3 million to a Las Vegas crime family. He's planning to use the hotels as collateral. Your carefully planned inheritance is already promised to criminals. The look of betrayal on her face was almost funny, the would-be killer feeling betrayed by her accomplice's deception. He wouldn't, she said, but doubt was creeping in. He's on the phone with them right now, I said. Go listen if you don't believe me. She actually left, presumably to eavesdrop on Marcus. I immediately called Nathan. It's happening, I said. Grace just tried to inject me with something. It's all on camera. And I think they're about to turn on each other. I'm on my way with Agent Harrison, he said. Lock your door and don't let anyone in. But I didn't need to lock my door. Within minutes, I heard Marcus and Grace screaming at each other downstairs. Their alliance hadn't just fractured, it had shattered completely. Grace was accusing Marcus of betraying her, of planning to cheat her out of her share. Marcus was calling her sloppy, saying her poisons were going to get them both caught. In their rage, they forgot about me entirely. They were so busy destroying each other that they didn't notice the FBI agents surrounding the house, didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. The arrests were almost anticlimactic. Grace was in the middle of throwing a vase at Marcus when Agent Harrison announced their presence. Both of them froze, looking like children caught in a fight, before reality set in. Marcus tried to run. He made it 3 steps before being tackled by an agent who looked like he'd played college football. Grace didn't run. She stood there, staring at me as I came down the stairs flanked by Nathan and another agent. You were awake, she said, as if that was the real betrayal. That night 3 weeks ago. You were awake. Every second, I confirmed. I'm your sister, she said, as if that still meant something. No, I replied. You were my sister. Now you're just someone who tried to kill me for money. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, no vindication. Just a hollow emptiness where love used to live. Nathan stayed with me as the FBI processed the scene, taking evidence, photographing everything. Dr. Hartley arrived to provide her medical documentation. Diana came with boxes of digital evidence. James brought papers that would protect my assets from any legal challenges. The news broke within hours. Hotel heiress targeted in murder for inheritance plot. Sister and husband arrested in poisoning scheme. Mob connections uncovered in attempted murder case. The headlines were sensational, but James and his crisis management team controlled the narrative carefully. The focus stayed on the crime, not on me. The hotels were mentioned only as context, not as the center of the story. My employees rallied around me in ways I never expected. Messages of support poured in. Several offered to donate blood or organs if I needed them, not knowing that my cancer was actually in remission. The loyalty and genuine care from people I employed stood in stark contrast to the betrayal from people I'd loved. The trials would come later. Marcus would be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, bigamy, fraud, and racketeering related to his mob connections. He'd spend decades in prison if convicted. Grace faced attempted murder charges, fraud, forgery, and a host of other crimes that would likely result in a life sentence. The federal prosecutor was confident. The evidence was overwhelming. But that was all in the future. That night, after everyone had left, after the crime scene tape had been removed, after the house had been declared safe, I stood alone in my kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd pretended to collapse, where I'd confronted them with their crimes, where their partnership had finally imploded. I thought about the Victoria from 6 weeks ago, the one who'd believed she was dying, who'd trusted her husband and sister to care for her in her final days. She'd been naive, perhaps dangerously so, But she'd also been capable of love, of trust, of faith and family. That Victoria was gone now, another casualty of Marcus and Grace's crimes. In her place stood someone harder, warier, but also stronger. Someone who'd looked death in the face. Not from cancer but from the people who should have protected her, and survived. Someone who knew that family could be the greatest threat of all. The house felt different now, contaminated by what had happened within its walls. I would sell it, I decided. Start fresh somewhere without the ghosts of betrayal lingering in every room. The hotels would continue to thrive under my leadership, now that I actually had a future to lead them into. The cancer that should have killed me had instead revealed the cancer in my life, the malignant relationships that had been slowly destroying me from within. As I climbed the stairs to pack a bag, I'd stay in a hotel until I could find a new home. I paused at the bedroom doorway. This was where it had all started, where I'd pretended to sleep while my world collapsed around me, where I'd made the choice to fight back rather than fade away. The room was just a room now, stripped of its power to hurt me. The bed where I'd lain vulnerable while they plotted my death was just furniture. The doorway where they'd stood was just an entrance. The power they'd had over me had been an illusion, sustained only by my trust and their deception. Once I'd seen through it, they'd had nothing. I turned off the light and closed the door, leaving that chapter of my life in darkness where it belonged. Tomorrow I would begin the long process of rebuilding. Not just my health and my business, but my ability to trust, to love, to believe in the possibility of genuine human connection. But tonight I would simply celebrate being alive. Truly, completely, victoriously alive. Against all odds, despite their best efforts, I was still here. And that, more than any revenge or justice, was the ultimate victory. The motel room I checked into that night was modest, part of a chain that was as far from my luxury hotels as possible. I needed the anonymity, the simplicity, the absence of anything that reminded me of my life. I sat on the bed, still wearing the clothes I'd worn during the arrests, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My sister had tried to murder me. My husband, who wasn't even really my husband, had planned to feed me to criminals. The two people I trusted most had seen me not as family but as an obstacle to their enrichment. The magnitude of that betrayal was almost incomprehensible. My phone rang. Olivia Hartman. "I just saw the news," she said without preamble. "I'm coming over." "I'm not at home." "I know. Nathan told me where you are." "I'm in the lobby." Minutes later, she was at my door with a bottle of wine and a box of tissues. "I had a feeling," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "When I saw you last week, I knew something was terribly wrong." For the first time since this all began, I broke down completely. Sobbed in the arms of a friend who wanted nothing from me but my continued existence. The tears were for everything, for the sister I'd lost, for the marriage that had never been real, for the innocence I'd never get back, for the Victoria who'd believed in the goodness of family. Olivia let me cry, occasionally refilling my wine glass, never offering platitudes or false comfort. When the tears finally stopped, she said simply, "You survived. That's all that matters right now." "But at what cost?" I asked. "I'll never be able to trust anyone again." "That's not true," she said firmly. "You trusted Nathan to help you. You trusted Dr. Hartley with the truth. You trusted Agent Harrison to handle the arrests. You're trusting me right now. Your ability to trust isn't broken, Victoria. It's just more selective. And that's not a bad thing." She stayed the night, sleeping in the chair beside my bed like a guardian angel in designer clothing. When I woke from nightmares, Grace's face as she held the syringe, Marcus discussing my death like a business transaction, Olivia was there, grounding me in the present, reminding me that I was safe. The next morning brought a call from Agent Harrison. "We've been going through the evidence," she said. "There's more here than we initially thought." Grace had connections to other elderly victims who died under suspicious circumstances. "We're reopening 3 cases from the past 5 years. My sister was a serial killer." The thought was so absurd I almost laughed. Grace, who'd cried at our mother's funeral, who'd rescued injured birds as a child, who'd been my maid of honor, she'd been killing people for their money for years. Were any of them actually sick? I asked. One had early-stage dementia. The others were healthy until Grace became involved in their lives. She positioned herself as a caregiver, gained their trust, then slowly poisoned them. You're the only one who survived. Because I pretended to sleep. Because one night of fake slumber had revealed the truth that had saved my life. The randomness of it, the sheer luck was staggering. Marcus's situation was even more complex. The FBI had connected him to a multi-state fraud ring, all tied back to Castellano's organization. My husband had been a small fish in a very large, very dangerous pond. His attempt to use me as bait to clear his debts had put him on the FBI's radar in ways he'd never anticipated. He's looking at federal racketeering charges, Harrison explained. Life in prison if convicted. He's already trying to make a deal, offering information about Castellano's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Will he get it? Not if I have anything to say about it. The attempted murder charge alone should keep him locked up for decades. After the call, Olivia and I went to breakfast at a small diner where no one knew who I was. The normalcy of it, eggs and toast and coffee that wasn't poisoned, felt like a miracle. What now? Olivia asked. I honestly don't know. The hotels need attention. The employees need reassurance. The board needs to see that I'm stable and in control. But all I want to do is disappear. Then disappear, she said simply. Take a month, 2 months, whatever you need. Your company survived your cancer treatment, it can survive your recovery from this. And you need to recover, Victoria. This kind of trauma doesn't just go away. She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on surviving, on gathering evidence, on stopping Marcus and Grace, that I hadn't considered what came after. The aftermath stretched before me, undefined and daunting. That afternoon I met with James and my executive team. They were shocked by the revelations but steadfast in their support. My CFO, Margaret Chun, had apparently suspected something was off with Marcus for years, but hadn't wanted to interfere in my personal life. My head of operations, David Kumar, had already prepared contingency plans to ensure the hotels ran smoothly during any extended absence I might need. Take the time you need, Margaret said. We've got this. Their competence and loyalty were a balm to my battered spirit. The business Robert and I had built would survive this crisis because we'd hired good people, people with integrity that my own family had lacked. I decided to visit the Carmel property, my favorite of all our hotels. It was smaller than the others, more intimate, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. I took the owner's suite, a space I'd designed but rarely used, and settled in for what I thought would be a few weeks of recovery. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. After months of preparation, depositions, and pre-trial hearings, I'd built it up in my mind as some grand amphitheater where justice would be dramatically served. Instead, it was a functional space with uncomfortable wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her once perfect appearance now reduced to an orange jumpsuit and hair that hadn't seen professional styling in months. She'd aged a decade since her arrest, the carefully maintained facade of youth and vitality stripped away along with her freedom. The prosecutor, Amanda Richardson, was a force of nature, mid-40s, sharp as a blade, with a reputation for never losing a case involving attempted murder. She'd taken a special interest in this one, she told me, because of the calculated cruelty involved. Family murders were common, she said, but the level of planning Grace had demonstrated was exceptional. Your sister is a predator, Amanda had explained during our preparation sessions. She identified vulnerable targets, gained their trust, and systematically destroyed them. You weren't her first victim, Victoria. You were just the first to survive. The other victims' families filled 2 rows behind the prosecution's table. I'd met them during the pre-trial period, children and grandchildren of elderly people who died under suspicious circumstances while Grace was in their lives. Harold Brennan's daughter, whose father had died just 6 months after hiring Grace as his real estate agent. Margaret Wu's son, whose mother had succumbed to a mysterious illness weeks after naming Grace as a beneficiary in her will. Thomas Garrett's widow, who'd always suspected something was off about her husband's sudden decline but could never prove it. We'd formed an unlikely support group, bound by our shared experience of Grace's deception. They looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and something else, gratitude perhaps, that someone had finally stopped her. Marcus's trial was scheduled separately, the federal charges requiring a different venue. He'd been denied bail, deemed a flight risk with his connections to organized crime. I'd heard through Nathan that he'd tried to contact me dozens of times from jail, letters that went unopened, calls that went unanswered. Whatever he had to say, I didn't want to hear it. The first day of Grace's trial, I testified for 6 hours. Amanda walked me through the timeline methodically, the cancer diagnosis, the power of attorney, the overheard conversation, the poisoning. I'd practiced my testimony dozens of times, but nothing prepared me for looking at Grace while describing her betrayal. She stared at me throughout, her expression cycling between false innocence and barely concealed rage. "Can you identify the woman who poisoned you?" Amanda asked, though we all knew the answer. I pointed at Grace. "My sister, Grace Chun." "Let the record show the witness has identified the defendant," the judge intoned. Grace's attorney, a public defender named Mitchell Barnes who looked overwhelmed by the case's complexity, tried to paint me as confused, paranoid, possibly suffering from cancer-related delusions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings Nathan had made, the poison found in Grace's room, the forged documents, the testimony from Dr. Hartley about the arsenic in my system, it all painted a clear picture of attempted murder. "Isn't it possible," Barnes asked during cross-examination, "that you misunderstood your sister's intentions? That she was simply concerned about your welfare?" "She was concerned about my welfare," I agreed. "Specifically, about how to transfer it to herself after my death." A ripple of dark laughter went through the gallery. The judge called for order. "You claim your sister poisoned you," Barnes continued. "But you're sitting here today apparently healthy. How do we know you were ever really in danger?" Amanda objected before I could answer, but the damage was done. The defense's strategy was clear. Minimize the crime by emphasizing my survival. If I was okay, how bad could Grace's actions really have been? Dr. Hartley's testimony demolished that argument. She brought charts, slides, blood test results that showed the systematic poisoning over months. She explained how the arsenic levels in my system had been calibrated to cause decline without immediate death. How Grace had clearly researched dosages to maintain the appearance of natural cancer progression. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Hartley stated clearly, "Ms. Morrison would have been dead within 6 to 8 weeks if the poisoning had continued. The fact that she survived was due entirely to her discovery of the plot and cessation of consuming the poisoned items." The forensic accountant's testimony was equally damaging. He detailed the complex web of financial fraud Grace had perpetrated, not just against me but against her other victims. The jury saw spreadsheets showing millions of dollars diverted, properties transferred through forged documents, life insurance policies taken out without the victim's knowledge. Grace wasn't just a murderer. She was a one-woman criminal enterprise. On the third day of the trial, something unexpected happened. Grace asked to speak with me privately. Her attorney advised against it, the prosecutor advised against it, everyone advised against it. But I needed to hear what she had to say. Needed to understand if there was any humanity left in the sister I'd once loved. We met in a small conference room, guards standing just outside. Grace looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by her circumstances. For a long moment we just stared at each other across the metal table. "You always were too smart for your own good," she finally said. "Smart enough to stay alive," I replied. She laughed, a bitter sound. "Do you want to know when I started hating you?" I said nothing, but she continued anyway. "When we were kids and Mom and Dad would introduce us to people. This is Victoria, our brilliant daughter. And this is Grace. Just Grace. Never our beautiful daughter or our talented daughter. Just Grace, the afterthought. That's not true, isn't it? You got the scholarships, the opportunities, the praise. I got compared to you. Every achievement I had was measured against yours and found wanting. So you decided to kill me for it? To kill others?" She shrugged, the casualness of it chilling. "I decided to take what the world owed me, what it gave so freely to people like you." "People like me?" I repeated. "You mean people who worked 18-hour days building a business? People who sacrificed everything for success? People who were born lucky," she corrected. "Smart, pretty enough, charming when needed. The universe's chosen ones." The delusion was complete. In Grace's mind, she was the victim, striking back against a world that had unfairly favored others. The elderly people she'd killed, including me in her attempt, were just privileged obstacles to be removed. I loved you, I said quietly. Despite everything, I loved you. You were my sister. Love, she scoffed. Love is what people with money can afford to talk about. The rest of us have to be practical. There was nothing more to say. The sister I'd grieved for had never really existed. In her place sat a stranger wearing Grace's face, animated by resentment and greed. As I stood to leave, she spoke one more time. I would do it again. All of it. The only thing I'd change is making sure you were actually asleep that night. I left without responding. There was no point. Grace was already gone, replaced by this hollow creature who saw murder as a practical solution to financial problems. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, fraud, forgery, poisoning, elder abuse. The list went on. When the verdict was read, Grace showed no emotion. She'd known it was coming, had probably known since the moment of her arrest. But she'd wanted her day in court, wanted to make me sit there and relive it all. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional consecutive sentences for the other murders she'd been connected to. She would die in prison, alone and forgotten, the very fate she'd planned for her victims. As she was led away, she looked back at me one last time. No apology, no regret, just a cold stare that promised she'd spend every remaining day of her life hating me. I met her gaze steadily, then turned and walked away. She didn't deserve another second of my attention. Marcus's trial was a different kind of ordeal. Federal court, RICO charges, connections to organized crime that made headlines nationwide. I testified via video link, unwilling to be in the same room with him again. He'd lost weight in jail, his former charm replaced by desperation. His attorney tried to paint him as a victim too, a man who'd made bad investments and gotten in over his head with dangerous people. But the evidence told a different story. Email chains showing he'd been planning to use my death to clear his debts for years. Records of his bigamous marriage, the life he'd been living in Nevada while pretending to be my devoted husband. Testimony from Linda, his legal wife, about how he'd abandoned her when her startup failed, taking their savings with him. The FBI had used Marcus to get to Castellano, offering him a deal if he testified against the crime boss. But even that cooperation couldn't save him from serious time. 25 years minimum, the judge declared, for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, bigamy, and racketeering. He'd be in his 70s before he had any chance of parole. I didn't attend his sentencing. I'd heard what I needed to hear, seen justice served. Marcus was already fading from my memory, a bad decision I'd made while grieving Robert, a lesson learned at an enormous cost. The media coverage was intense but brief. Other scandals quickly replaced mine in the public consciousness. My hotels saw a temporary surge in bookings from the curious, which my marketing team handled brilliantly, pivoting the attention toward our property's unique histories and luxury amenities, rather than their owners' personal drama. 6 months after the trials ended, I stood in my new home, a modest but beautiful cottage in Mendocino, far from the San Francisco mansion where everything had fallen apart. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before me, viewed through windows I'd had specially installed to maximize the vista. I'd downsized dramatically, selling off properties, simplifying my life to its essentials. The nightmares had mostly stopped, though occasionally I'd wake thinking I heard Grace and Marcus whispering in the doorway. Therapy helped, as did the support group for survivors of attempted familicide, a term I'd learned described the attempt to murder family members. We met monthly, sharing our struggles to trust again, to feel safe in our own homes, to reconcile the people we'd loved with the monsters they'd revealed themselves to be. Olivia visited regularly, bringing wine and gossip from the tech world I'd left behind. She'd taken over some of my board positions, keeping me connected to the business community without requiring my direct involvement. The hotels were thriving under Margaret Chen's leadership as CEO. I'd promoted her after realizing I no longer had the heart for day-to-day operations. Nathan and I developed an unexpected friendship. Not romantic, that ship had sailed long ago, but something deeper. He'd seen me at my absolute worst and helped me survive it. We had dinner once a month, usually at some hole-in-the-wall restaurant where we could talk freely about the investigation, the trials, the aftermath. Any regrets? He asked during one of these dinners, about a year after Grace's conviction. I considered the question. I regret trusting them. I regret not seeing the signs sooner. But I don't regret exposing them if that's what you're asking. That's not what I'm asking. I knew what he meant. Did I regret the public spectacle, the family destruction, the complete severance of my only remaining family ties? Sometimes, I admitted. I think about what would have happened if I'd never overheard that conversation. If I just continued taking Grace's poison, trusting Marcus's lies. I would have died, obviously. But I would have died believing they loved me. There's something almost merciful about that. That's not mercy, Nathan said firmly. That's delusion. And you were never one for delusion, even when it would have been easier. He was right. Even in my grief after Robert's death, even in my vulnerability during cancer treatment, some part of me had remained alert, suspicious of too perfect devotion. That vigilance had saved my life. Dr. Hartley and I stayed in touch, meeting for coffee every few months. My recovery had become something of a medical case study. Not just the cancer remission but the psychological resilience required to survive what I'd endured. She was writing a paper about the intersection of medical and criminal victimization, using my case as an example with my permission. You're remarkably well adjusted, she told me during one meeting, considering everything that happened. I'm good at pretending, I replied, only half joking. No, she corrected. You're good at surviving. There's a difference. The distinction mattered. I hadn't just pretended to be okay. I'd actively worked to become okay. Therapy, support groups, rebuilding my life on my own terms, all of it was survival work, the hard labor of continuing after betrayal. One unexpected positive came from the trial's publicity. 3 other families contacted authorities about suspicious deaths of elderly relatives, deaths that shared characteristics with Grace's victims. While she was already serving life in prison, these additional cases brought closure to families who'd suspected foul play but never been able to prove it. I testified at 2 of these trials describing Grace's methods, her psychological manipulation, her complete lack of remorse. Each time I saw my own story reflected in these families' experiences. The gradual isolation of the victim, the positioning of Grace as essential caregiver, the mysterious illness that responded to no treatment, the financial documents signed in confusion and weakness. She'd had a template, a playbook she'd refined over years of predation. The detective who'd investigated these cold cases told me something that haunted me. Your sister was escalating. The time between victims was decreasing. The amount she stole increasing. You were meant to be her big score, the one that set her up for life. If you hadn't stopped her, she would have continued indefinitely. I thought about all the potential victims saved by Grace's imprisonment. Elderly people who would now live out their natural lives. Families who wouldn't suffer mysterious losses. In a strange way, my suffering had served a purpose beyond justice for myself. It had prevented future tragedies. Marcus's situation grew more complex after his conviction. The FBI discovered he'd been more deeply embedded in Castellano's organization than initially thought. He'd been laundering money through fake consulting contracts, using his supposed financial expertise to clean dirty money. My marriage to him had been part of a long-term plan to acquire legitimate businesses for criminal purposes. The revelation that I'd been not just a murder target, but an unwitting shield for organized crime activities was disturbing. How many times had criminals been in my home? How many business associates of Marcus's were actually mob connections? The FBI conducted a thorough investigation of my businesses, ensuring no criminal money had contaminated them. Thankfully, Marcus had kept his 2 lives separate, planning to merge them only after my death. Agent Harrison called me when Castellano was finally convicted, partly based on Marcus's testimony. Your ex-husband's cooperation was crucial, she said. He's hoping it might reduce his sentence. Will it? Not enough to matter. He'll still die in prison, just maybe in a slightly nicer facility. There was poetic justice in that, Marcus trapped by the very criminals he tried to use against me, his cooperation buying him nothing but a marginally more comfortable cage. 2 years after the trials, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney. The return address was the federal prison where Marcus was held. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. Inside was a single paragraph. Victoria, I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm writing to tell you that everything you suspected is true. I never loved you. You were a mark from the beginning, chosen for your wealth and vulnerability after Robert's death. Grace approached me with the plan before we even met. That conference where we randomly encountered each other? She arranged it. Every moment of our relationship was calculated. I thought you should know the complete truth. Marcus. The confession should have hurt, but it brought a strange relief instead. I'd suspected as much, but having confirmation eliminated any lingering doubt about the legitimacy of our relationship. It had all been fake, every kiss, every kind word, every moment of apparent intimacy. Grace hadn't just tried to poison my body. She'd poisoned my entire life with carefully placed lies. I burned the letter that night, watching the paper curl and blacken in my fireplace. With it went the last vestige of connection to Marcus. He could rot in his cell, knowing he'd destroyed his life for a plan that failed. I had better things to do than waste another thought on him. The cottage in Mendocino became my sanctuary. I learned to garden, growing vegetables and flowers with the patience I'd once applied to building businesses. There was something healing about creating life after being surrounded by so much death and deception. My tomatoes didn't lie, my roses didn't betray. They simply grew or didn't, responding honestly to care or neglect. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a mixed breed named Bartleby who'd been abused by previous owners and trusted no one. We were kindred spirits, both of us learning slowly that not everyone meant harm. Training him required patience I didn't know I possessed, but gradually he transformed from cowering and aggressive to cautiously affectionate. Watching him learn to trust again gave me hope for my own emotional recovery. The local community in Mendocino knew who I was. The story had been too public to hide, but they treated me with respectful distance. I was the woman who'd survived a murder plot, yes, but I was also the person who donated generously to the library, who volunteered at the animal shelter, who bought vegetables at the farmer's market and remembered everyone's names. Slowly, I became just Victoria, not the victim or the heiress or the cautionary tale. 3 years after the arrests, Olivia convinced me to attend a charity gala in San Francisco. I'd been avoiding such events, unwilling to face the stares and whispers, but she insisted it was time to reclaim my place in society. You can't hide forever, she said bluntly. At some point, isolation becomes self-punishment. She was right. I'd been so focused on healing that I'd forgotten about living. The gala was for a cause I cared about, funding for domestic violence survivors, and my absence would be more noted than my presence. I wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, and entered the ballroom on Olivia's arm. The conversations didn't stop, but they stuttered, eyes tracking my movement across the room. I held my head high, smiled at acquaintances, made small talk about innocuous subjects. By the end of the evening, I'd remembered who I was beyond the victim. I was a successful businesswoman, a philanthropist, a survivor, but not only a survivor. That night marked a turning point. I began accepting more invitations, rebuilding my professional network, even considering new business ventures. Not hotels this time. I'd lost my passion for hospitality, but technology investments, startups founded by young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself decades ago. I became a mentor, sharing not just capital but wisdom earned through success and failure. One investment particularly engaged me. A startup developing technology to help elderly people maintain independence while staying safe from exploitation. The founder, a young woman named Jessica whose grandmother had been scammed out of her life savings, pitched it as protection through connection. The system monitored financial transactions for suspicious patterns, health metrics for sudden changes, and provided regular check-ins that couldn't be intercepted by would-be exploiters. It wouldn't have saved your victims, Jessica said carefully during our first meeting, aware of my history, but it might have raised red flags sooner. I invested heavily, not just with money but with time and expertise. We refined the product together, adding features based on my horrible experience. Alerts for new powers of attorney, warnings about unusual document signings, patterns that might indicate poisoning rather than natural decline. It became my mission to prevent others from experiencing what I and Grace's other victims had endured. The irony wasn't lost on me. Grace's crimes had led to the creation of technology that would prevent future Grace-like predators from succeeding. In trying to destroy me, she'd inadvertently inspired a legacy of protection for vulnerable elderly people. Dr. Hartley invited me to speak at a medical conference about recognizing signs of intentional poisoning in patients. Standing before hundreds of doctors, I described the symptoms I'd experienced, the patterns Grace had created to mimic cancer progression, the subtle differences Dr. Hartley had detected that revealed the truth. It was difficult reliving those months of deterioration, but if it helped one doctor save one patient, the discomfort was worthwhile. The key, I told the audience, is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. My survival began with a moment of suspicion, a sense that the devotion being shown to me was performative rather than genuine. Don't dismiss those feelings in yourself or your patients. After the talk, several doctors approached me with their own stories of suspicious deaths they'd encountered, cases where family members seemed too eager for an elderly relative's demise. We formed an informal network, sharing information about patterns and warning signs, creating resources for medical professionals to identify potential elder abuse. For years after the arrests, I received news that shook me despite my best efforts at indifference. Grace had been attacked in prison, seriously injured by another inmate who discovered she'd targeted elderly victims. She survived but was permanently disabled, confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others for basic care. The irony was sharp, the predator reduced to prey, the woman who'd exploited vulnerability now completely vulnerable herself. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sympathy, just a hollow acknowledgement that karma sometimes manifested in unexpected ways. Grace would spend her remaining decades dependent on the kindness of people who knew exactly what she'd done. There was justice in that, though not the kind any court could have imposed. Marcus made the news again when he testified in another trial, this time against former associates of Castellano who'd been captured years later. He looked terrible in the photographs, aged beyond his years, hollow-eyed, clearly suffering in custody. His cooperation bought him transfer to a minimum security facility, but he was still facing decades of imprisonment. Like Grace, he'd become a cautionary tale, a warning about the price of greed and deception. Neither of them tried to contact me again. They'd become footnotes in my story rather than central characters, their importance diminishing with each passing year. The opposite of love, I learned, wasn't hate. It was indifference, and I'd finally achieved that blessed state of not caring about their fates. 5 years after that night I pretended to sleep, I met someone. His name was Richard, a widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. We met at the farmer's market, both reaching for the same bunch of carrots, laughing at the cliché of it. He was a retired professor, kind and patient, with no interest in my money or business connections. He knew my story, everyone did, but treated it as just that, a story from my past rather than my defining characteristic. We took it slowly, both of us carrying scars from loss and betrayal. He'd been devastated by his wife's death but not destroyed by it. I'd been nearly murdered by people I loved but not broken by it. We understood each other's caution, respected each other's boundaries, built something genuine on a foundation of mutual wariness that gradually transformed into trust. "I'm never getting married again," I told him early in our relationship. "Good," he replied. "Neither am I. But dinner would be nice." Dinner became dinners, became weekends, became a comfortable companionship that required no legal documentation or formal commitment. We kept separate homes but shared meals, conversations, gentle affection that demanded nothing beyond the present moment. It wasn't the passionate romance of youth or the calculated partnership I'd had with Marcus. It was something quieter, safer, more honest. Two people choosing each other daily without obligation or expectation. The hotels continued to thrive under Margaret's leadership. I remained the majority owner but stepped back from operations entirely, content to receive quarterly reports and annual dividends. The properties I'd poured my heart into became simply investments, successful ones that funded my new life but no longer defined it. Robert would have understood, I think. He'd always said the business was a means to an end, not the end itself. On the 5th anniversary of the arrests, Olivia organized a dinner, not a celebration but an acknowledgement. Nathan attended, as did Dr. Hartley, Agent Harrison, even Diana, who'd uncovered so much of the digital evidence. We gathered at a private room in a restaurant, raising glasses to survival, to justice, to the strange bonds forged through crisis. "You've all saved my life," I said, looking at each face around the table. In different ways at different times, but each of you played a crucial role in my survival. You saved your own life, Nathan corrected. We just helped with the paperwork. We laughed, but he was right in a way. The moment I'd chosen to pretend to sleep rather than confront Grace and Marcus immediately, I'd taken control of my survival. Everything that followed had been my choice, to investigate, to gather evidence, to prosecute, to rebuild. They'd supported those choices, but the choices themselves had been mine. As dinner concluded and we prepared to leave, Agent Harrison pulled me aside. There's something you should know, she said quietly. We've been monitoring communications from the prison. Grace has been corresponding with someone, possibly planning something even from inside. We're investigating, but you should be aware, maintain caution. The old fear flickered briefly, then died. Grace could plan all she wanted from her cell. She had no power over me anymore, no access to my life or assets. Whatever scheme she might be hatching would come to nothing. I'd learned to protect myself too well to be caught again. Thank you for telling me, I said calmly. Keep me informed if anything develops. But I didn't lose sleep over it. Grace had become like a chronic illness, something to be monitored and managed but not allowed to dominate my existence. She could rot in her cell, planning imaginary revenges she'd never be able to execute. I had better things to do with my remaining years than worry about a caged predator's fantasies. Richard was waiting when I returned home, reading in my living room with Bartleby curled at his feet. The dog who'd once trusted no one now accepted this gentle man who'd never raised a hand in anger. The sight of them, comfortable in my space without owning it, warmed something in me that I'd thought permanently frozen. Good dinner? Richard asked, looking up from his book. Good enough, I replied, settling beside him on the couch. Old ghosts properly exorcised. He understood without requiring explanation, returning to his book while I picked up my own. We read in companionable silence, the ocean visible through the windows, the sound of waves providing a peaceful soundtrack. This was what I'd built from the ashes of betrayal, not a new family to replace the one that had tried to kill me, but a chosen peace, a deliberate tranquility, a life defined by what I'd selected rather than what I'd inherited or married into. The past would always be there. The scars, both physical and emotional, permanent reminders of what I'd survived. But scars, I'd learned, were just evidence of healing, proof that what had been broken could mend, differently perhaps but strongly enough to continue. And continuing, living fully despite everything, was the ultimate victory over those who tried to end my story prematurely. Outside, the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I watched it descend, thinking about Grace and Marcus in their separate cells, watching the same sun through bars. They'd wanted my life, my assets, my death. Instead, they'd gotten decades of confinement while I got this freedom, peace, a future they tried to steal but failed to grasp. I smiled, not from vindication but from genuine contentment. They'd lost everything in their attempt to take everything from me. But their loss wasn't my gain. My gain was simpler. Another sunset to watch, another day to live, another choice to make about my own existence. And that, more than any revenge or justice, was enough. 10 years had passed since that night I pretended to sleep, and I stood in my garden watching the sunrise paint the Mendocino coastline gold. At 63, I moved differently now, cancer survivor, attempted murder survivor, but most importantly, simply a survivor. The morning ritual of coffee and contemplation had replaced the frantic business calls that once started my days. Richard had moved in 6 months ago, a decision we'd reached gradually, naturally, without the grand declarations that had marked my relationship with Marcus. We'd simply realized we were spending every night together anyway, maintaining 2 homes was impractical, and Bartleby had claimed Richard's reading chair as his own. The domesticity was quiet, unfrenetic, real in a way my previous life had never been. The call came while I was deadheading roses. Agent Harrison, whom I hadn't heard from in 2 years. Victoria, I need to inform you of something. Grace died last night. The words hung in the morning air. I waited to feel something, relief, sadness, anything. But there was only a distant acknowledgement, like hearing about a stranger's passing. How? I asked, more from courtesy than curiosity. Complications from her previous injuries. She'd been declining for months. The prison medical staff did what they could. After hanging up, I continued gardening. Grace had been dead to me for a decade already. Her physical death was merely administrative closure. I didn't call anyone, didn't mark the moment. I simply moved to the next rose bush, carefully removing spent blooms to encourage new growth. Richard found me there an hour later. "You're crying," he observed gently. I touched my face, surprised to find tears. "My sister died," I said, the words feeling strange. "The sister I had before she became someone else died 30 years ago. I suppose I'm mourning her again." He understood, as he always did, the complexity of grieving someone who tried to kill you. He stood with me among the roses until the tears stopped, then we went inside for breakfast. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to endings. The news of Grace's death brought unexpected communications. Her lawyer contacted me. Apparently she'd left a will. The irony of it, my would-be killer having the audacity to bequeath anything, was almost amusing. "She'd left me a letter," he said, "written years ago and held in trust for this moment." I burned it unopened. Whatever Grace had wanted to say could remain unsaid. Closure was something I'd given myself years ago. I didn't need her version of it. Marcus was transferred to hospice care 3 months later. Lung cancer? Aggressive and untreatable. Nathan called with the news, having maintained contacts in law enforcement who kept tabs on such things. "He's asking to see you," Nathan said. "Says he has information about other potential victims of Grace's. Names he never revealed." It was manipulation, certainly. Marcus's final attempt to control something to make me come to him. But if there were other victims, other families who deserved answers. I went. Not for Marcus, but for those hypothetical others who might gain peace from knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The prison hospice was cleaner than I'd expected, quieter. Marcus lay in a bed that seemed too large for his wasted frame, oxygen tubes and 4 lines creating a medical web around him. "Victoria," he wheezed, attempting his old charm through cracked lips. "You came. You have information about Grace's victims," I said without preamble. "Share it or I leave." He laughed, which became a cough, which became a struggle for air. When he could speak again, his voice was different, stripped of pretense. "There are no other victims," he admitted. I lied. "I just needed to see you once more." I stood to leave, but his next words stopped me. "I did love you, you know. In my way. As much as someone like me could love anyone." "Your love included planning my murder," I reminded him. "Yes," he agreed simply. "Because I loved myself more. But for what it's worth, you were the only real thing in my life. Everything else was performance." There was nothing to say to that. His version of love was so twisted, so contaminated by selfishness, that it bore no resemblance to the actual emotion. I left him there, wheezing apologies I didn't need to hear. He died 2 days later, alone, his bigamous wife Linda having refused to claim his body. The state cremated him, his ashes scattered in an unmarked grave. An ignoble end to an ignoble life. With both of them gone, something shifted in me. The last threads connecting me to that nightmare finally severed. I was no longer a woman who'd survived attempted murder by her sister and husband. I was simply Victoria, living in Mendocino with Richard and Bartleby, tending roses and funding startups that protected the vulnerable. The technology company I'd invested in with Jessica had grown into something remarkable. We'd prevented dozens of cases of elder abuse, flagged numerous attempted frauds, possibly saved lives. Jessica invited me to speak at our annual conference, introducing me as the inspiration behind the technology. I declined. That chapter was closed. Instead, I funded a scholarship at my old business school, the Victoria and Robert Morrison Entrepreneurship Award. It went to students from disadvantaged backgrounds, those who'd overcome significant obstacles. I never met the recipients, didn't want their gratitude or their stories. It was simply wealth doing what wealth should do, creating opportunities for those who'd use them better than my sister ever did. One morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Harold Brennan's daughter, Sarah, one of the family members from Grace's other victims. She brought her teenage daughter, a serious girl who watched me with curious eyes. "I wanted Emily to meet you," Sarah explained. "To understand that surviving isn't just about getting through something. It's about what you build afterward." We had tea in my garden, Emily asking careful questions about resilience, about choosing to trust again after betrayal. I told her the truth, that it was daily work, that some days were harder than others, that scar tissue was stronger than original skin but less flexible. But you're happy now? Emily asked with the directness of youth. I considered the question. Happy seemed too simple for what I'd achieved. Content, perhaps. Peace, definitely. Free, absolutely. I'm myself, I finally answered. Fully and completely myself. That's better than happy. They left with roses from my garden and something more. The knowledge that survival could lead to something beyond mere existence. That even the worst betrayal couldn't destroy the capacity for joy, for love, for the small pleasures of morning coffee and evening sunsets. Richard and I married the following spring. Not a grand affair like my wedding to Marcus, just a simple ceremony in our garden with 12 guests. Olivia stood as my witness, Nathan as Richard's. We exchanged rings and vows that promised nothing beyond what we could actually deliver. Companionship, respect, shared dinners, separate reading spaces when needed. I promised to never pretend to be asleep when you're speaking, Richard said, making our small gathering laugh. Only I truly understood the weight of that promise, the significance of genuine unconsciousness versus performed slumber, the trust required to actually sleep beside another person. The hotels were sold that summer to an international chain that promised to maintain their character. The money went into trust foundations, causes that mattered. I kept enough to live comfortably but not ostentatiously. Wealth had attracted predators. Modest comfort attracted only those genuinely interested in my company. Dr. Hartley retired, but we maintained our friendship, meeting quarterly for lunches where we discussed everything except cancer and poisoning. She'd written her paper, won awards for it, potentially saved lives through education about medical manipulation. But between us, we talked about books, travel, the peculiar joys of aging. On the 10th anniversary of that night, I found myself unable to sleep. Not from fear or trauma, but from a strange need to mark the moment. I rose carefully, not wanting to wake Richard, and walked to the window. The moon was full, illuminating the ocean in silver streaks. 10 years ago, I'd lain in bed pretending unconsciousness while my life collapsed around me. Now I stood at a window in a house I'd chosen, with a man who'd earned my trust, living a life constructed entirely on my own terms. The journey between those two moments had been brutal, had stripped away everything I thought I knew about love and family and trust. But it had also revealed an essential truth: we are not defined by what others do to us, but by what we choose to do next. Grace and Marcus had wanted my money, my properties, my death. They'd gotten none of it. Instead, they'd given me something infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that I could survive anything, trust wisely, love carefully, and build a life worth living from the ashes of one that had tried to kill me. I returned to bed, sliding beneath covers that held no threats. Richard stirred, reaching for me in his sleep, and I let myself be pulled into his warmth. This time, when I closed my eyes, I truly slept deep, unguarded, safe. The morning would bring its usual pleasures. Coffee, roses, Bartleby's insistent nose nudging for his walk, Richard's quiet humming as he made breakfast. Simple things that belonged entirely to me, that no one could poison or steal or twist into weapons. I had survived. More than that, I had prevailed. And in the end, that was the only revenge that mattered: living well, living fully, living free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.